And we are good. We are live.
Right.
The tweets will now be tweeted. And good to go. Okay, so and one thing that I have wanted to ask you about directly for a while, knowing a little bit about your past in activist circles,
Mm-hmm.
namely, making your activist bones, so to say, around anti-war activism,
Yeah.
is how do you personally perceive the meaning of the Democratic Party nominating not just somebody who voted for the Iraq War? That would be bad enough, right?
Right.
But nominating someone who was integral in facilitating the initiation of the Iraq War, in that the war probably never would have gotten the requisite support to be waged if prominent Democrats hadn't lended their imprimatur to it.
Right.
And Hillary Clinton, in being the senator representing New York State, which had just been attacked on 9/11, was probably the most desirable Democrat for the Bush administration to court in their war-making endeavor, right? So if you go back and look at the speech that she delivered on the floor of the Senate when she voted to authorize the war, she specifically referenced 9/11 as a motivating factor as to why she felt that risks couldn't be allowed to fester or something along those lines. I have the
Right.
exact quote somewhere, but you get the idea. Um, and then so not only did she help facilitate the invasion itself, she then ran the entire 2008 primary campaign against Obama, um, with a central plank being that the war authorization vote was correct.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't relent on that point through the entirety of the 2008 campaign. And only in 2014, when she published her widely unread memoir, Hard Choices, did Hillary finally admit that the war was a mistake. So who knows what could have shifted her from her deeply held belief in those intervening years, but the shift finally came.
Okay.
So this is the person, and as we all know, and we're seeing unfold right now, as the United States is launching another battle in Mosul as we speak. The ramifications are with us very much to this day. So, I mean, just in broad strokes, what does that indicate to you about the Democratic Party?
Well, I mean, look, there's a few like dimensions to this. I mean, one of them is simply that Hillary Clinton is a hawk, right? I mean, and not in a particularly interesting way. I mean, that she's always been a hawk. That she has one of the most hawkish records in the Senate. I think you can make the case that it's kind of a classic Democrat dilemma, which is that they want to, you know, Democrats always want to like. Sorry about the sirens. Democrats always want to sort of play off of weakness, right? They always want to sort of chase in the direction of what's perceived as their weakness. And it's true that because Hillary is always going to suffer from sexism in politics, given the reality of American political life, I think that she has been hawkish, extra hawkish, in part because she feels that she has to politically shore up her sort of foreign policy credentials by supporting everything that comes along. So if you look at, I mean, even setting aside Iraq, right? She to this day says that she would not change anything that she did in Libya. So she was the single most influential pro-intervention voice within the Obama administration when we had the frankly disastrous Libyan intervention, which resulted in, the people that we wanted to win taking over, and their first act was to criminalize homosexuality. That faction then lost power in a series of political struggles, and it continues to be an ongoing civil war in Libya. It became the ISIS's most important area outside of Iraq and Syria. It was dissolved into total chaos. There's nothing resembling democracy in Libya right now. And yet she continues to say that it was not a mistake. And I think a lot of that does come from the fact that she feels like she has to be an ultra hawk in order to avoid accusations of being, like a weak woman or whatever. But even more to the point, the broader sense is that the Democrats are a hawkish party They sort of their hawkishness is different from Republican hawkishness. They use different rationales, and I do think that altogether they're sort of less directly belligerent. But you just have to look at the way that they've used Russia, and this Cold War posturing this election for sort of short-term political gain. Democrats will chase any war if they think that it's going to be in their best political interest. So she's not a particularly interesting Democrat in that way. She's just another Democrat, and that the sense that Democrats are this hawkish, or excuse me, are this dovish party is a lie and has always been a lie. And that, there's, I am not one to say that there's no difference between the two parties. I think there are differences and that they matter. Neither party is what I would call a remotely compelling alternative. But the place where there is really no alternative in American political life is foreign policy, where Samantha Power wants you to go to war, and she mentions a lot of like humanitarian reasons for it. And Condoleezza Rice wants you to go to war, and she mentions a lot of sort of anti-terrorism reasons for it. And even Pat Buchanan wants you to go to war, and he mentions American strategic interest for it. But there is no alternative to being a pro-war national American politician. Such a thing does not exist.
Yeah, and this is all the more ironic because one principal reason why Obama gained traction against Hillary in the 2008 primary was the perception that he did present some kind of alternative in the foreign policy realm, right? I don't know if you remember the big to-do about whether Obama would be willing to sit down with dictators and directly negotiate with them. Mm-hmm. And Obama and Hillary called him naive for that. And arguably that policy distinction between Hillary and Obama led indirectly to the opening with Cuba, which is probably one of the better accomplishments of the entire Obama administration. Mm. So even these fine gradations in difference, it would seem, can have hugely consequential impact, which is why it was so dispiriting to me during the Democratic primary that foreign policy played such a subordinate or minimal role.
Well, I mean, a part of that was because Bernie Sanders doesn't have a foreign policy background, and he really had very little to say of use about foreign policy. I mean, I like Bernie in some ways. I have not been impressed with his post-primary behavior, but it was not inaccurate for his critics to say that he doesn't really have a strong foreign policy background. Now, I would argue that we would actually prefer someone who doesn't have a strong foreign policy background, in the sense that what it means to have a strong foreign policy background in American politics is to be hawkish. But there was tons of opportunity for Hillary to get hit from the left on foreign policy. I think that would have been very effective, but he just didn't have the chops to talk about it, to be frank with you.
Yeah, and he on occasion he did bring up some issues, like there was the famous Henry Kissinger moment at one of the debates, which was great. Weaponizing Henry Kissinger was long overdue, and everyone was glad that he was still alive and lucid to experience it. Yeah. But even so, it definitely was not a major theme of the campaign in the way that it was in 2008. And yeah, I would say Sanders himself is culpable for that. And I would agree that his post-primary behavior has really not been that exemplary. But this is something that you touch on quite frequently. But even though Sanders has basically done everything in his power to support Hillary Clinton unflinchingly, he's been deployed to rebut various criticisms against her in recent weeks that have been that Sanders supporters have leveled in the wake of the WikiLeaks revelations, which show now, as a matter of just plain fact, that the Democratic primary process was not fairly managed. Right? It was skewed, undoubtedly, by people running the body that was supposed to be and was avowedly neutral. So now they've sent out Bernie to rebut criticisms of this and said we need to move on. He even used the famous Obama dictum, we need to look forward, not backward. Right, yeah. And yet there's still people don't. I mean, the Clinton loyalist camp still don't seem fully appreciative of that. Let's say, and what?
You know,
How do you perceive how that's being interpreted now?
well, I mean, I don't know how it's being interpreted. It's clearly true that, I mean, look, the American liberalism is an anti-left ideology before it's pro anything else. If you go study the history of liberalism, if you want to go back to, the Truman era purges of socialist sympathizers in the Democratic Party, if you want to look at the 60s era, sort of Kennedy, staunch anti-communist wing of liberalism that really helped to ensure that the social movements of the 60s didn't persist into the 70s. If you want to look at the sort of Clinton era 90s and the just total acceptance of what really are, by any definition, center-right politics. Or if you want to look at the post 9/11 world, where people like Peter Beinart, writing in places like the New Republic, said that the Democratic Party had to have a purge of all of its anti-war voices. I mean, he said that. You can look it up. That is
No, I remember that.
Yeah, I mean that being anti-left animates the Democratic Party. I always tell people this: look at these big sort of Democrat group blogs, right? You have these kind of fossilized holdovers from like 2004. There are these Democrat group blogs where people, you have these sort of people writing under pseudonyms, Liberal Mom 25 or whatever, or Yellow Dog Dem 55, and they have all these commenters, and they just whip themselves into these frothing kind of sort of hate sort of spectacles. They hate Glenn Greenwald far more than they hate Mitt Romney, right? I mean, if you look at like what actually gets those people's rocks off, if you look at like what they respond to emotionally, the anti-left stuff is always more bitter. It's always more passionate. It's always more angry. American liberalism is an anti-left phenomenon, right? I mean, the reason that the liberalism exists, right, is to suck passion out from real reform movements. If you look at the history of this country, in the first half of the 20th century, the American labor movement won concessions for workers that have changed the world ever since, right? If you look at things like the weekend, if you look at things like the 40-hour work week and the 8-hour workday, if you look at things like opposition to child labor, if you look at things like OSHA, if you look at things like, any kind of meaningful extension of real worker power, was won not just by labor movements and socialist labor movements, but specifically by the American labor movement, which is why May Day is an international celebration, not just of labor, but of the American labor movement. But then you have things like the New Deal, which, I mean, if you were going to put a gun to my head and say, would you rather have the New Deal or not have it? I'd rather have it. But the reason that the New Deal existed, right, was to undercut that movement. It was to sort of offer a sort of capitalist friendly version of the things that the labor movement was able to offer through direct power. And that informs liberalism to this day. I mean, look at someone like Neera Tanden, right? She has a very good chance of being the chief of staff for the Hillary administration. She's still attacking Sanders months after he had got on board. She's still attacking Sanders' people. Anyone who looks at her tweets will see that she has more like sort of personal animus towards left-wing critics of Hillary than she does towards Trump supporters. I mean, that's just any objective analysis of her actual behavior will show you that. And that's the core of the Democrat Party. I mean, they've never wavered from that in my lifetime. I mean, my lifetime has been, Clinton, it's been sort of post 9/11 world. And now it's, then it was Hope and Change, right, which was perceived to be a sort of left-wing reform movement. And of course, Hope and Change became the Heritage Foundation healthcare plan and drones forever,
Yeah, and speaking of Neera Tanden, and I hate to dwell on her because I don't know, she's just a functionary. But at the same time, she is like emblematic of a certain disposition, I would say, in Clinton land. But just this morning, she's tweeting out the anticipatory rationalizations of war against Russia. So that's a great development.
I mean, it's like, I mean, yeah. So like, I mean, it's a perfect example I don't think that like modern day Democrats particularly care about going to war with Russia, but they perceive weakness on the front of whatever they think, being belligerent towards Russia gives them, right? Like they think it makes them look tough to talk about it. And by the way, they can say that, the emails that are clearly authentic, right, only exist because, I don't know, like some ex KGB guy sort of shipped Julian Assange a zip drive or whatever. But I mean, it's just, I mean, Neera Tanden is who she is. Like, she's a vicious anti-left voice, just like Peter Dow is a vicious anti-left voice. Like Tom Watson is a vicious anti-left voice. The Democrats are absolutely full of them. And you ask, I talk to Democrats all the time. I say, where is the analog within conservatism, within the Republican Party that you're talking about, right? There's anti-Trump people, but Trump isn't even a conservative, right? There's no such thing as a really anti-conservative Republican. There are more moderate and then more extreme conservatives, but there's no anti-conservative movement within the Republican Party. And yet the sort of the leadership of the Democratic Party is anti-left to its bones. And when people wonder, like, why, if we have this supposedly unbeatable coalition, right? Like, if this is really the era of the emerging Democrat majority, why can't Democrats get anything done? It's because they're always working against their own interests, right? Because they absolutely refuse to actually take a left-wing stance.
I can anticipate a conservative replying to you and saying, "Hey, wait a second. It's false to posit that there's no analog on the right side, right?" So we have the Republican nominee, Trump, who does have a pseudo-organized opposition to him within his ostensible coalition, right? And Trump is not a conservative in the traditional sense, but I think you could broadly classify him as a type of conservative. It's obviously a nationalistic conservative who shuns the movement conservative ideology that's been dominant since the Reagan years. But he is a conservative of a certain bent, right? And there has been just a vociferous effort on the part of certain people in that party for a long time to oppose him in the primary, to find a third-party challenger, and now they're even going so far as to explicitly help Hillary, so to ensure his defeat.
Right.
So why is that disanalogous?
Well, it's disanalogous because what are Trump's actual kind of like political convictions? Like he has been talking a lot of sort of anti-trade stuff. Is being anti-free trade really a right-wing proposition? I mean, it's not free market right-wing. He, stared into a camera and said that he was pro-choice to his core, not that long ago. He's anti-immigration, which is sort of perceived as Republican, but again, like really hardcore sort of laissez-faire economics people want there to be free immigration. The thing is about Trump is that he has no core, right? Part of what makes him so frightening is that, like, when people call him a fascist, I often feel like saying, I feel like fascists actually had like ideas, they actually had like values. They had terrible values, but like I knew what they stood for. Trump, I have no idea what he is beside, a fucking sexual predator in a bad suit. You know what I'm saying? Like,
but Hillary has no real core either, right? And neither did Bill. I mean, it was just their core was to triangulate in service of seeking and consolidating power.
Right. I mean, that's true. I mean, I would say that Bill's core is like being a moderate Republican. You know what I'm saying? Just in the Democratic Party. I mean, at least.
Yeah, but they would both easily track left if that was the politically opportunistic thing to do, and which they did superficially for this primary.
Maybe that's right. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess you could say that Trump is a real analog, but for whatever reason, right? Go to a random state level primary, right? The Republicans who are fighting that be the Republican candidate will say, don't worry, I'm the real conservative, right? I'm farther right than my opponent. Go to a random Democrat primary and they'll say, don't worry, I'm not that left wing. My opponent is a crazy radical, but I'm a moderate. And the default difference between the two parties is the Republicans fight to be the more conservative challenger. Democrats fight to be the moderate. And in politics, the extremes define the center. So the Republicans sort of pull the center to the right. Then Democrats try to chase the center to be at the exact center. So even when they win, right, they find themselves playing in Republican territory, and they never get it. I don't understand why they don't grasp this very basic aspect of politics.
Yeah, I think Trump individually kind of frustrates this analogy somewhat. But yeah, if you look at just a generic congressional primary on the Democratic side versus a generic congressional primary on the Republican side, what you just outlined would hold true.
Yeah.
With exceptions in certain, heavily Democratic enclaves, say in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Where where it wouldn't necessarily be advantageous to tack to the center,
but what does Brooklyn liberalism look like, right? I mean, part of the problem here is that the sort of intellectual core of liberalism as being an economic materialist philosophy has been hollowed out, right? Like, if you ask someone like what a default liberal position is now, it's gay marriage, which is very important. Obviously, it's been a big victory, but
it's already law of the land.
Well, and Goldman Sachs, right? Like has rainbow flags outside of it, right? Like the economic core has been completely sort of ripped out of the sort of liberal self-conception, in part because the Obama coalition was a wealthy coalition, and Hillary's is even worse. I mean, Hillary has doubled the number of people donating in at least $100,000 to her campaign compared to Obama. And Obama was already a record holder in that regard. I mean, when I say that the Democrats have become the party of the rich, people get mad, but it's just objectively true, And it's really hard to maintain an economically populist self-conception when the donor class is opposed to that.
Yeah, that story just, I don't know if you're referencing the story that came out today, I think, in Politico, which showed that the big money operation of the Clintons now is the biggest big money operation of all time.
Yeah. There's never been anything like that machine. I mean, the Clintonite machine is,
and they helped build that machine with the foundation, right? So when they weren't ostensibly seeking high office, they were nevertheless accruing political power under the auspice of charity and global health and all these other kinds of initiatives. And not coincidentally, those serve as the base from which they drew donors for the official campaign.
Right. I mean, look, like, it's one of the bizarre aspects of American politics is that, to state the plain truth, that political parties are more responsive to the donor class than they are to just rank and file voters is like to be accused of being a conspiracy theorist, right? So it's crazy to think that Hillary, who earned millions of dollars giving speeches to the richest people in the world, the idea that like she would have some sort of fealty to them because of that's supposed to be a conspiracy theory. But
and we know that during some of those speeches, which the transcripts of which she had previously concealed, despite giving assurances or at least hinting at the fact that she'd look into "quote unquote" releasing them, right? We now know that in some of those speeches, namely at Goldman Sachs, it's funny when you look at these Goldman Sachs speech transcripts, it really is like she was saving up the juiciest insider info for her colleagues at Goldman Sachs. So she would go to Goldman Sachs and talk to them about Syria strategy in Iran,
right.
and similar things, because she sees them as her illustrious peers.
She said in a speech that it was a matter of debate or a matter of controversy whether the banking industry actually caused the financial crisis, which is, I mean, that's just fucking insane, right? like I hope
That's a
to God,
conspiracy theory.
I hope to God that she was just pandering to an audience
I
when
don't
she
think
said
so.
that it's complicated if the banking industry caused a financial crisis. Of course, the banking industry caused a financial crisis. The basic status of this election is this, right? The critics of both candidates are completely correct, right? So Trump actually is a proto-fascist, racist, nativist, demagogue, sexual predator monster, right? And yet, which makes him actually worse than Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton actually is a warmongering tool of the 1%, right? And I'm sorry to say that if I was forced to at gunpoint make a choice, I would choose the warmongering tool of the 1%. Luckily, in this country, I'm not forced to make that choice. And so I will not be voting on election day. And you can all send me shitty emails about that, which I can delete a lot faster than you can write them. But like both sets of criticism are correct. And so what you say to yourself is, okay, well, maybe the rational thing to do is to ask how to get better alternatives than those two shitty alternatives. Unfortunately, the Democrats won't allow you to do that, right? Republicans are worse than Democrats, but Democrats are bigger impediments to progress. Because when you try to even have a conversation about how to get to a better alternative than the lesser evil, Democrats lose their minds, right? So again, at gunpoint, I'd rather have Democrats running this country than Republicans. However, it's Democrats who don't even let you begin to have the conversation about how are we going to fix this fucked up country, right? Every time you try to talk about, okay, how do we get a better alternative than Hillary Clinton? They turtle up. They call you deluded. They say that you're engaged in purity politics. They accuse you of being self-righteous, and they stop listening, right? Like any conversation about strategy for moving the country to the left and for getting a better alternative than the lesser evil, Democrats, like really committed Democrats, don't want to have it. And so they're the enemies of progress because they refuse to allow us to have those conversations. I don't know what their vision of progress is, right? The thing about always being a lesser evil is that as the bigger evil gets worse, the bar just gets lower and lower, right? So,
Let me just dwell on a point that you make there quickly because I think it's important. And I also should declare, even though I've done this time and time again, countless times now, but it's never good enough for some people, that I do not support Trump. I do not advocate a vote for Trump. I oppose Trump. I cannot be any more clear about it. But there are still cynical people on the internet who will try to misconstrue, these remarks. That said, okay, let's stipulate for the sake of argument that Hillary is more likely to initiate some kind of cataclysmic war or a confrontation with Russia in relation to Syria. So she's already declared her intention to wage some kind of cyber attack against Russia in retaliation for the alleged Russian-directed attack on the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign, right?
right.
And Trump, at least on the surface, and he has been fairly consistent. He hasn't been consistent about much, but he's been consistent in his ostensible wish to forge some kind of détente with Russia, right?
Yeah.
So let's just stipulate that Hillary is more likely to
start a war with the country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal.
Right, and Trump is less likely to do that. Is it therefore clear that she is the lesser evil?
Well, the problem is again, like Donald Trump has no principles. Like it's not. I mean, sure, maybe he would be the less hawkish on Russia, or maybe the minute that he was in power, we'd have the fucking Trident missiles, flowing to Moscow. Nobody knows, right? You have the combination.
That's why we're stipulating. Let's say he is the lesser,
Okay.
the lesser threat to Russia in that regard.
I would like to believe that the threat of mutually assured destruction is still so powerful that we won't get into a hot war with Russia. Although the Syria situation scares the shit out of me because the number of like supposedly anti-imperialist leftists I know who want to, set up a so-called no-fly zone in Syria, which absolutely certainly would create a hot war with Russia.
It necessitates it.
It necessitates it. I don't think that we're going to get that. I mean, look, here is my most sort of extreme anti-Hillary argument from a strategic perspective that I can think of. I think that whichever party wins the White House in 2016 will lose it in 2020. I think if Trump were to win somehow, and it's looking very unlikely, thank God, I think that he would certainly lose the presidency in 2020. But I also think that Hillary's going to lose the presidency in 2020. I think that Republicans are going to get tired of losing. I think that they're going to find a way to systematically cast out the alt-right and the Trump supporters. I think that they might become a third party that can get consigned to irrelevancy. And I think they're going to nominate some Scott Walker type who is just as racist as Trump and just as awful, but who knows how to code it, right? Like if you pay attention to this campaign, like so much of the complaints about Trump are complaints about like propriety, right? He doesn't.
It drives me up the wall.
Yeah, he doesn't sort of dog whistle. He just whistles, right? And that's incredibly dangerous because it means that in 2020, the media is going to be so starved for a narrative of a good Republican that when someone like Scott Walker or whoever comes along who codes their racism in the right way, they're going to become a very powerful potential candidate. And look,
it's going to be, they're going to go behind Rubio for sure.
I mean, the thing is, well, I don't know if Rubio wants to be president, but somebody like that. And the thing is Democrats have forgotten that politics is cyclical, or at least liberals have. They've gotten very used to holding the presidency. You just don't hold the presidency for that long. And there's a conservative backlash brewing in this country. I've been saying it for years. Liberals are completely unclear about what
especially among the youth, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the early 90s, I was in the heart of sort of PC culture, and that led directly to the Newt Gingrich revolution, right? The late 60s led to the early 70s. I mean, we've seen this movie many times, but liberals can't imagine it's to be a liberal Democrat is to constantly yaw back and forth between complete fatalism and complete triumphalism, right? Like the only modes that they have to express themselves are, holy shit, the sky's falling, Jill Stein, who controls like 300,000, hippie grandmother votes. She's going to cost the election, but also we have an enduring Democratic majority that, thanks to the changing demographics of this country, can't be beaten, right? They don't have a position between total panic and total triumphalism, right? So they can't comprehend the fact that all of the sort of changes in our culture, and many of which I would personally identify as progress, although my critics would think that I wouldn't, that this is brewing a backlash, and the Republicans just have to get a little bit smart. And maybe it won't happen in 2020, but if it doesn't happen in 2020, it's going to happen in 2024. And we are primed for an absolute shellacking of Democrats. They have no ground game. They have no sort of vision of how to convince anyone of anything because they've become so sort of enamored of yelling at people on Twitter and, sort of politicking through shame.
The Trump candidacy has given them an excuse to stay mired in those pathologies, right?
Right. Well, look, people have pointed this out, but this is literally a contest between the least popular politician in American presidential history, which is Trump, and the second least popular politician, which is Clinton, right? I mean,
and at various times, she actually has matched him in unpopularity. I don't know if it's the same right now, but it's been pretty darn close.
I mean, the basic fact of the matter is the Democrats have really powerful electoral college advantages right now. And Trump also has the additional problem. I've been saying to people that Trump probably, if anything, his polls are probably optimistic for him because the Republicans he doesn't have any ground game. So many Republican organizations have withdrawn any kind of support for him. It's not clear to me that they're going to have the sort of election day get out the vote stuff that you need to win, right? Like, it's really important that your national party be driving little old ladies to the polls. It's really important that people make sure that everyone who polled and said, yeah, I'm going to vote for that person actually gets out and does it. Democrats, for whatever strange reason, completely ignore state politics, but they have a really good national politics, presidential politics machine. And so I think that Hillary's lead is even more dominant right now than it's been represented as. But things change, and it's just going to take one, Confederate asshole with a new suit and a smile and someone who knows how to play the game so that they code their anti-Mexican racism and they code their, all this sort of bizarre stuff that Trump says, and they hide it. And the media will give that person a pass because they're desperate to look even-handed. They really want to find a good conservative to rally behind. And also because politics is cyclical. And I think there's a lot of resentment with Democrats bubbling up as they, preside over a Gilded Era economy,
Yeah, just for the record, and this is kind of neither here nor there, but I would probably give Trump a 20 to 30% chance of winning, so a little bit higher than the consensus take on where his odds are at now. Only because I think the enthusiasm gap is in Trump's favor even still. So if he has a highly motivated core of voters who are going to get themselves to the polls no matter what, to at a substantially greater level than Hillary does, I think that could marginally compensate for whatever advantages the Democrats have in terms of ground game. But so much of the punditocracy is focused on projecting future events that it's not really that fruitful of an exercise.
Well, it's just weird. I don't know what the point. Like, if you look at, I'm not the first person to make this point, but if you look at like 538.com's projections, I don't understand the point of a projection that swings so quickly in one direction or the other. If you're actually trying to make meaningful predictions about the future, that's useless to you, right?
It's kind of, it's a really good way to draw a lot of clicks, though, right?
Yeah. I think that Trump just has big problems. Potentially, right, his poll numbers are underestimating his support because people could be embarrassed to tell a pollster that they support him, but they might pull the trigger in November if that's true.
Yeah, and then another thing kind of militating in his favor is that Gallup asks the same question every September, which is do you plan to vote?
Right.
And the number of people aged 34 and younger who said that they were going to vote was at its lowest since 2000, I think.
If only there was some candidate who had energized the youth.
Yeah,
the Democrat. I just like imagine an alternative.
As Obama did in 2008, right? And that was seen as a big advantage of him. But for some reason, this time around, it was seen as sort of like trivial or even shameful that Sanders did it.
Like imagine an alternative universe where the Sanders revolution is happening in the Republican Party. Right? Republicans suck, right? But they suck, but they have strategic and understanding of politics the Democrats just don't fucking get. Imagine that there was some flaming righty, right? Like some like extremely conservative guy compared to traditional sort of what's within the bounds of American politics, who had energized this incredible youthful base and who had a online apparatus unlike any we've ever seen, who had this tremendous upswell of popular support, who was being carried on a wave of small money donations by regular people. Maybe that person wouldn't win the nomination, but he would have been embraced. He would have been elevated. They would have taken the time to try to capture that movement. Democrats didn't just not vote for Bernie Sanders. The Democratic sort of power base didn't sort of say, we don't want him to be president. They did everything they could to vilify his supporters, right? All we got for months was not just that Bernie Sanders was wrong, but that Bernie Sanders was a racist and a sexist and a horrible human being, and all of his supporters are racist and sexist and horrible human beings. You couldn't do more than the DNC and the Democratic sort of power base did to alienate, reject, and discourage those voters, right? Those Bernie Sanders voters.
And their media,
And it's just like they'll never understand it. Like the Democrats are gonna they're gonna underperform in the Senate races, I'm sure, the down ballot stuff, and they're gonna say, "Wow, why didn't we get the Senate?" And it's like, well, maybe because you had a sort of natural populist movement that had unprecedented youth enthusiasm. Like literally in the history of American politics, you can't find margins like Bernie's margins among millennials. And so, of course,
including black millennials, right?
Right, which is the other thing, which is, this whole narrative. The more that voters of color found out who Sanders were, right, the more likely the more likely they were to vote for him. That in fact, the gap with voters of color was in fact a gap of he just didn't have a big national presence among them. And by the way, Bernie Sanders' base, as it turned out, was young women, which we were saying over and over again, but of course that was ignored. And Democrats didn't say to themselves, well, we like this guy and his movement, but we don't think he's right for this year, but we will cultivate them and we'll groom them and we'll try to bring them into the party. No, they said, we're going to destroy this movement, right? Because centrist Democrats are such a miserable group of power-mongering losers that they can't win. They refuse to have the kind of movement that could potentially result in an actual long-term Democratic victory. They would rather rule over the party as a centrist Democratic Party than they would that loses than they would to be just part of a left-wing Democrat Party that wins. I fully believe that people like Joan Walsh and people like Clara Jeffrey at Mother Jones, people like Peter Dow and Tom Watson, people like Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo would rather be part of a centrist Democrat Party and be dictating terms and have that party lose than they would rather be just some voices in a left-wing party that wins. I'm absolutely certain of that.
And that's why, the people who are the exalted media allies of those Democratic functionaries did everything they could, not just to vilify the supporters, which was this really just off-the-wall, insane little side gig they took up, but they would even brandish all these kinds of analytical takes on why the Bernie Sanders support base was not what it seemed, right?
Right.
So it wasn't a potent political force. It was just like failed Democratic insurgents of the past.
If you listen to what they were saying, right, they wanted it to be the case that there was less enthusiasm for a left-wing movement. Can you imagine people within the Republican Party leadership being excited to say that there's less of a right-wing resurgent movement than there is? It would never happen in a million years. If there was actually like an insurgent, like really like passionately right-wing movement within the conservative movement, within the Republican Party, they would embrace it wholeheartedly. Democrats are trying to convince you that, well, this isn't actually that big of a deal. Because the Democratic Party is a center-right party. It's been a center-right party since at least the '92 election, and people just this stuff would annoy me so much less if people like Neera Tanden and Joan Walsh would just say, yeah, you know what, I'm a center-right kind of person. Hillary's a center-right kind of politician, and I embrace that. But they have to maintain this bizarre two-step where they simultaneously claim to be the real left wing and then discourage and despise everyone who is on the actual left wing.
Yeah, and Hillary herself did this. So she was, she got caught in a fundraiser categorizing herself as center right. Meanwhile, in public, she was saying she's the progressive who gets things done.
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre.
And the wholesale adoption of the Bernie bro thing, it seemed sort of trivial at the time, but it really did leave a lasting scar, and I think, on the feasibility of a substantive, fair-minded political discourse.
Right.
And the fact that it wasn't rebutted, and it was just kind of accepted as dogma that you can tarnish people based on the activities of a random set of internet trolls whose genuine provenance isn't really known. So a lot of instances, many of these people who were cited as the most noxious Bernie bros were revealed to have been actual trolls posing as Bernie supporters.
Well, we know for a fact that Blue Nation Review and Peter Dow, we know for a fact that David Brock, right, like had a anti-Bernie troll army, right? I mean, that's in the
And they still
documents.
have it, and they still have it, and they're feeding paranoia
Right.
in having that. So they're still at now, and so on Twitter you never know which anonymous person is a Brock troll, a paid Brock troll, or a genuine troll.
Right. Yeah.
So they're kind of like I don't know. They're sort of gaslighting in a way, right? Because they're making people question whether they're accurately gauging what's before them, because it might be this other force, trying to confuse things.
I have a lot of friends who are optimists, and they're sort of socialist left or radical left like me, and they say, well, the Democrats are the Democrats, but they're not going to be able to ignore this Bernie thing anymore, and the party's going to move to the left. And I just find that totally untrue. Like, I think that, in fact, what we're going to see, if Hillary wins, what we will see is the DNC and the Democrats will work overtime to make sure that everyone who was involved in the Sanders campaign is marginalized, and that they never have this problem again. I think this is going to serve as a wake-up call to the center-right power base within the Democratic Party. And they're going to make the determination that they need to get control of the party, even if that means losing elections, and that they will invest all their resources in expunging all elements of the Bernie Sanders campaign and of left-wing reform. Like, I don't think that someone like Neera Tanden has it in her to work with people who are to her left. That fundamentally, when you look at the way that she behaves, and again, like, this is someone who will soon be one of the most powerful people in the Democratic Party, if she isn't already. Like, fundamentally, she would rather crush her enemies on her left than she would to win victories over people to her right. And it's her own behavior that demonstrates that. And so I think rather than seeing some sort of flowering of left-wing Democrats, I think we're going to see the exact opposite, which is we're going to see a Democratic Party that recommits to Clintonism, to capitulating to the conservatives, to triangulation, and to being a center-right party.
Yeah, everything will be cast aside in service of supporting the agenda of the incumbent president, right?
Right.
And that will be Hillary, and her governing philosophy, which she articulated herself, will be center-right. And she and Bill have made this well known for decades now. It's not going to be a shock.
Right.
And this kind of bears on what annoyed me so much in the primary, and even continues today to some extent, which is that there was this refrain that by people of the Joan Walsh ilk, not to single her out, but people of that mindset would always say, we appreciate Bernie Sanders' contributions to the discussion. Right. And they would pat him on the head, and they would thank him for energizing people. And they would offer him this kind of like bad faith advice on what he must do. So that's always a pun. That's like a pundit genre, right? Offering that phony advice to people who you don't actually support and don't want to win. When the way to implement his agenda, rather than just head patting him and giving him meaningless concessions in the platform, would have been if he actually won.
Right.
But they never wanted him to win.
I mean, again, like, there's a way to win an election and then try to embrace the people and platform of the candidate that you beat. We just have to look at Neera Tanden's behavior in the Democrat platform meetings, right? When she was lying about what she was saying, I mean, telling blatant lies, for example, about her stance on the Palestine issues. When she was attacking Ben Jealous, which we later saw in the emails that she has contempt for, the former chairman of the NAACP. When she, I mean, look, like, you only had to look at the immediate aftermath of the primary to see the fact that we're talking about, which is, again, the Hillary Clinton campaign is not at all dedicated to left-wing principles, and to whatever degree they waved in that direction in order to win a primary, they have since signaled that they're going to go back on it. But then again, if you're opposed to fracking, you must be working for Putin, right? So.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I mean, they can now attribute so much of, they can now attribute the fact that we're aware of their behind-the-scenes machinations to some kind of sinister foreign interference. Right. So it kind of absolves them of culpability for what they did, because they can just point to the alleged, source of that information and say, don't look that way. I mean, we're the victims here.
Right. I mean, I think if the fact of the matter is I think that Hillary is going to win a comfortable victory in a few weeks. Um, like in order for Trump to win, he has to run the table in a number of competitive states. Hillary just needs to grab one of them, and it essentially becomes game over. I mean, when you are spotting somebody, New York and California are both at like 99%, right, for Hillary. When you're spotting somebody, all of these highly populous states from the get-go, it becomes really hard to hit that number. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that Hillary is going to win the campaign. It's not clear to me that Democrats want to win congressional victories, because that means that they actually have to produce on an agenda. It's not clear to me what the agenda that they want actually is. I mean, I still don't know what Democrats stand for.
Yeah, and one thing that's been amazing to me, and we'll wrap up in a little bit, but is that the election has now become a referendum on the personality of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, could there be a more superficial issue for the election to hinge on? Right. I mean, we have the world's most powerful military. The economic situation is disastrous for a lot of people. There's obviously a huge cultural alienation out there in some of these immiserated areas. Like I was just in central Maine, where some of the mills that had once sustained the local economy have closed as recently as 2014. So this is a recent acute phenomenon that is bedeviling people in these areas. It's not just, you'll have a lot of pundits roll their eyes and say, oh, there's this inordinate focus on manufacturing as sort of this idealized past. Right. Well, for a lot of people, no, it's their present, and it just happened. Right. So, we have all these issues at play, Syria, foremost among them, and we're having a referendum on Donald Trump, on the 1996 Miss Universe pageant. It just seems extremely decadent to me, and it's almost as if there hasn't been a Democrat in the White House for 8 years. I mean, you'd never know it based on the Hillary campaign rhetoric.
I mean, just as maybe a wrap up, I keep coming back to this wall, right? To this border wall. Every liberal and Democrat I know is horrified by the idea of Trump's border wall. And I agree that it's an absurd, hideously racist, cruel policy idea. What I find bizarre is that we already have a wall in many parts of our border, right? I mean, like literally there is a wall on many parts of the Mexican border.
Or a fence, and that's a really key distinction.
We just built 600 plus miles of fence, right? Not that long ago, and that was authorized by Republicans and also by Democrats,
including Hillary Clinton.
Including Hillary Clinton. Our policy is already racist, horrifically inhumane, and terribly deadly, right? The real wall on the border is our policy, our immigration policy. It already exists, and it exists with the support of Democrats. And so I say to my liberal Democrat friends, okay, you hate Trump's wall, and yet you are supporting politicians who have already created this horrific, already existing immigration policy. What sense does that make? And they have nothing to say, right? Because at the core of liberal Democrats right now, there's just this absence, because they have rhetoric that has nothing to do with their actual beliefs. And until liberals actually start to say to themselves, do I want to reform our shithead immigration policy that's horrifically cruel, it divides families, it leaves thousands of bodies on the border over the course of decades? Or do I want to fixate on Trump's dumb wall and like write jokes about Drumpf and like sort of just tweet a hashtag about how he's a sexual predator? Like, what do you want to do? Like, what is sort of your priority?
And they have no affirmative vision of anything. It's all anti-Trump. I mean, it's incredible that this is what it's come down to in 2016.
Right. Well, that's what it is. It's it's so much easier to pay attention to beating the bad man, who I agree is a monster. He's a very bad man. But after we defeat him, right, the day after we defeat Trump is the day when the hard work should begin. But 90% of them are never going to think about politics again for another 4 years. And that's
and just a very, very quick addendum to that. You mentioned earlier that the animating principle of a lot of liberal politics is opposition to the left wing, and that's true. Yeah. But I think it does seem evident to me that in addition to the animus toward the left wing plank, what they really are is an anti-Republican party or an anti-Trump party. I mean, that does motivate. So it's now motivated in the entire Hillary campaign. They've made the Russia conspiracy thing a central feature of their campaign for months now because it has it reflects poorly supposedly on Trump, and it seems like they don't have anything. They have no vision that they themselves represent to put forward, other than to position themselves in opposition to the deplorable Trump and his deplorable supporters on one side, and the left wing agitators on the other side. So I think it's like a toxic stew of a combination of the two.
Yeah, they're going to have to lose. I mean, it's going to and that's going to be bad because they'll lose to conservative Republicans who will pass terrible things. But the Democrats aren't going to reform in any way until they suffer a really terrible electoral defeat. And that's going to happen. 2020, 2024, we're going to see an absolute shellacking of Democrats. They have absolutely no idea how to form a positive agenda. They have no idea how to convince people who don't already believe in what they think. And they are on the road to an unprecedented electoral defeat. And I'll be sad about that because what comes after will be terrible, but they will richly deserve to lose in that way.
Yeah, so I guess on that uplifting note, let us conclude. Thank you, Freddie.
Nice to talk to you, Mike.
Okay, bye.